The Lives of the Saints by Father Alban Butler, January 12th, Saint Marguerite Bourgeous. Marguerite was the sixth of the 12 children of Abraham Bourgeous, a candle maker, and his wife, Guillermina Garnier. She was born in Troyes, the main city of Champagne, in 1620. At the age of 20, Marguerite tried to enter as a postulant, first among the Carmelites and then among the Poor Clares, but both religious orders refused to accept her for reasons unknown to us. Marguerite was well known in Troyes as she was the president of the Congregation of Notre Dame of the Convent of the Canonesses of St. Augustine, founded by St. Peter Fourier and Blessed Alix Leclerc. Gendray, seeing that the two convents rejected Marguerite, interpreted this as a sign from heaven that the Blessed was called to lead a congregation of non-cloistered religious, which he had been planning for some time. So Marguerite and two other companions began the foundation, but the affair failed, and Marguerite returned home. In all these difficulties, she was sustained by a vision of the child Jesus, which, according to the Blessed's own expression, forever diverted her gaze from all the beauties of this world. In 1652, Marguerite's sister, who was a canoness of St. Augustine, received a visit from Paul de Maisonneuve, governor of the French colony of Ville-Marie, Montreal. The governor was looking for a school teacher for his small colony, and Marguerite, who had long been interested in Canada, recognized in this a divine call and decided to leave. She arrived in Quebec on September 22, 1653, and a month later, in Ville-Marie. The colony was reduced to a fort where about 2,000 people lived, a small hospital and a chapel occasionally attended by a Jesuit missionary. Marguerite made a kind of non-canonical novitiate for 4 years. She looked after the governor's house, took care of the few children in the colony, helped Jean Mance in the hospital, as well as the women of the garrison. He had the Great Cross of Montreal, which had been destroyed by the Indians, restored, and managed to build a new chapel dedicated to Our Lady, which was almost finished when the 4 ecclesiastical lords of St. Sulpice arrived in 1657. The following year, with the help of Marguerite Picard, he opened the first school in Montreal in an old stable and with no more than a dozen pupils. Despite this, Marguerite made plans for the future. The city was growing, and her work would undoubtedly increase. On the other hand, she also had to think of the children of the Indians. Where could she find collaborators? There was only one possibility. Marguerite set sail with Jean Mance for France. 12 months later, she was back with her old friend, Catalina Crollo, and 3 other young women. The following years were hectic and hard because of the war against the Iroquois. However, the school went on, and Marguerite added a new class for the children of the Indians, a homemaking course for the girls, and a Marian congregation. Montreal was also growing. At the end of the Iroquois War, it began to become a real city. From 1760 to 1762, Marguerite went back to France. King Louis XIV officially authorized the Blessed's work, and she returned to Montreal with half a dozen young people. Then it seems she began to think of founding a new religious congregation. On her return to Montreal, the fledgling community went through a period of poverty and difficulties, but God rewarded Marguerite's trust in him, and in 1676, the first bishop of Quebec, Bishop de Laval, canonically erected the first house of the Congregation of Notre Dame. But the difficulties were not over. Bishop de Laval had very personal ideas about the future of the congregation. This forced the Blessed to go to France for the 3rd time, without obtaining any results. Moreover, in 1683, the convent caught fire and 2 sisters burned to death, among them a niece of Marguerite. Bishop de Laval judged that the time was ripe to merge the small community with the Ursulines, who had arrived in Quebec since 1639. Marguerite humbly told the bishop that monastic enclosure would ruin the work, and he did not insist. But Bishop de Laval's successor, Bishop de Saint-Vallier, an irascible and obstinate prelate, put up great resistance to the Blessed before deciding to accept the idea of the first community of missionary nuns without enclosure that existed in the church. Finally, in 1698, the first 24 sisters were able to make their profession of simple vows. Mother Marguerite had ceased to be superior 5 years earlier. The first boarding school in Montreal was opened in 1673, and the first school for Indians in 1676. In 1679, there were already 2 young Iroquois girls in the congregation, Outside of Ville Marie on the island of Montreal, where in 1689 the Iroquois murdered all the men, women, and children they found outside the fort, schools were opened for the daughters of the French, and a little later in the vicinity of Trois-Rivières. In 1685, Bishop de Saint-Vallier called the nuns to Quebec, bringing the number of missions to 7. The figure of Marguerite de Bourgeous, the first schoolmistress of Montreal, stands out in the history of this congregation, which, having begun obscurely, must have numbered more than 200 houses. Marguerite, with her indomitable character, had triumphed over all obstacles, attacks by savages, fire, the difficulties inherent in colonization, the threat of poverty, and a certain lack of understanding on the part of her superiors. Like so many other foundresses of religious congregations, Marguerite is known above all for her work, in the creation of which she suffered the double ordeal of seeing her capacity for accomplishment questioned and of feeling terribly unworthy in the eyes of God. But courage was not the least of her virtues, and her ardent desire to help children and all her neighbors always carried her forward. The Blessed said, "I want at all costs not only to love my neighbors, but to make myself loved by them." C.W. Colby wrote in Canadian Types of the Old Regime, New York, 1908, "From the moment of her arrival in New France, Marguerite became the inspiration of those around her. Less austere than Jeanne Mance, less mystical than Marie de l'Incarnation, Marguerite brought together in her fervor a good many of those virtues which originate in human cordiality. We do not think we are exaggerating when we say that for 50 years Marguerite was, by her influence and her works, the first woman of Montreal. Goodness radiated from her whole person, and much of the success of her work is due to the wisdom of her methods, but Marguerite was above all a teacher. And the best that the biographer of women like Marie de l'Incarnation and Marguerite Bourgeois can do is to be content with relating the facts, because women of that stature have no need of praise. The best praise that can be given to them is to relate their deeds with the impressive simplicity of truth without adding any commentary. From the moment Marguerite resigned as superior, at the age of 73, her health and strength began to weaken, but the end came unexpectedly. On the last day of the year 1669, the foundress offered her life to save that of the novice mistress, who was seriously ill. The mistress of novices recovered her health, and Mother Bourgeois died on January 12, 1700. She was beatified in 1950.